Check 1, 2. Check.
We're going to get started. We're going to get started. Shelley and Fred, I invite you to come a little closer, if you like. I hope everyone is having a meaningful day. We are going to take a little bit of time we're going to take a little bit of time this afternoon to revisit a story which is very well known. In fact, it was also taught this morning, if you were here. We're not going to spend so much time on the story itself, but what I want to do is look at the larger context in which this story first appears. The story is found in the midrash Eikha Rabba, which is one of the earliest midrashic texts. So its presence in the tractate of Gittin, in the Talmudic tractate of Gittin, is a much later editorial move to put that story there in that tractate. But it was actually written in the Tannaitic period, which is the period sort of just after, somewhere up to around 200, just after the destruction of the temple. And the whole book itself is in many ways a rabbinic response to the book of Eikha and what it doesn't offer. Eikha is a very, very depressing text, right? It doesn't, aside from maybe the last line, it doesn't actually offer a lot of hope. It doesn't, a lot of the haftarot that we read leading up to Tisha B'Av, we read these kind of scathing rebukes by the prophets, but then there's a little bit of nechemta, there's a little bit of comfort or hope offered at the end. The book of Eikha doesn't really do that. It doesn't really offer a lot of explanation for why this is happening, for why the destruction is happening. So Eikha Rabba is in many ways a rabbinic attempt to step in and fill in those gaps, which are important for a lot of reasons. One, if you don't know why something happened, you can't then correct it. There's no possibility for tshuva. If the book of Eikha portrays God as simply a punishing, angry God, then where's the possibility for reconciliation? Where's the possibility for God to have mercy? And so Eikha Rabba is full of many midrashim that portray God as mourning and crying along with the people. That's not an image that we see in the book of Eikha itself. So Eikha Rabba, I think, gives us a lot of, can really give us a bigger picture than just any one story about the larger context and the way that the rabbis understood some of the aspects of the destruction in their time, their destruction of the Second Temple. So I want to just quickly read the story that many of us are familiar with. Again, some of you I know read it this morning. The destruction of Jerusalem came through Kamtza and Bar Kamtza in this way. A certain man who had a friend named Kamtza and an enemy named Bar Kamtza made a banquet. He told his attendant, "Go and bring Kamtza to join me at the banquet." The attendant went and mistakenly brought him Bar Kamtza. When the host arrived at the banquet and found Bar Kamtza sitting there, he said to Bar Kamtza, "Look here, that man, you, is the enemy of me. What do you want here? Get up and get out." Bar Kamtza said to him, "Since I have come, let me stay, and I will give you the value of whatever I eat and drink." The host said to Bar Kamtza, "No, I will not let you stay." Bar Kamtza said to him, "I will give you the value of half your banquet." Again, the host said no. Bar Kamtza said, "I will give you the value of your entire banquet." The host said to Bar Kamtza, "No." He grabbed hold of Bar Kamtza with his hands, stood him up, and ejected him from the banquet. Bar Kamtza said to himself, "Since the rabbis were seated at the banquet and did not rebuke him for the way he treated me, it is evident that what he did was acceptable to them. I will go and spread slander against the rabbis in the royal palace." He went and told Caesar, "The Jews have rebelled against you." Caesar said to him, "Who says so?" Bar Kamtza said to Caesar, "Send them an animal as a sacrifice and see whether they offer it in their temple." Caesar went and sent a fine calf with Bar Kamtza. As he was going to Jerusalem, Bar Kamtza caused a blemish in the calf's upper lip, or as some say, he caused a cataract in the eye. Either way, he ensured that the blemish was in a place where it is considered a blemish for us, an offering for the temple, but it is not considered a blemish for them outside of the temple. Although the animal was unfit to be offered in the temple, the rabbis considered offering it for the sake of peaceful relations with the Roman government. Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas said to them, "But people will say that blemished animals may be offered on the altar." The rabbis considered killing Bar Kamtza so that he would not be able to go and tell Caesar that the offering had been refused. Rav Zachariah said to them, "But people will then say the one who blemishes consecrated animals is put to death." Rav Yochanan said the scrupulousness or humility displayed by Rav Zachariah ben Avkulas in refusing to have Bar Kamtza put to death destroyed our temple, burned down our sanctuary, and exiled us from our land. So one question that we talked about a little bit this morning, and I just want to briefly get some ideas on the table, is who's to blame or who's responsible? Who is responsible? Ourselves. Okay, say more about that. I'm giving you the microphone so that the folks on the live stream can hear you.
I'm sure others can say it better, but we're faced with destruction. We are mortal. The temple sooner or later gets destroyed, and it does get destroyed. There's a conflict always in how we survive, if we can survive. So whatever happens in life is ultimately we make the choices, and we're struggling with the choices. We may not like them, and we may not have some, but that's it. It's within our realm.
So what in this story leads you to say that it's ourselves is responsible?
Well, I mentioned it this morning, but I see the story as a diversion, as a preoccupation with day-to-day faults and problems and issues, and we're not dealing with how do we prevent tragedy.
Okay, so I think there's really something in what you're saying, and we're going to see that come out as we turn in a moment to the midrashim from Eikha Rabba. But according to the text here, who can be pointed to say who's responsible? This person or these people are responsible.
The rabbis are responsible. They want to kill this person who is really trying to make something out of the situation. You know, even his motives to pay money, you know, to stay might have not been the right motives, but he didn't leave. So it seems like the rabbis are really, you know, let's just kill him because he's going to give people the wrong impression.
Okay, that's interesting. There are two places where we see the rabbis in action. We see the rabbi, or not in action,
Yeah.
not in action when he is at the banquet and they don't do anything. And that's often the place that's pointed to say the rabbis are responsible. They didn't do anything in that moment. But you're suggesting that it goes even further than that. They even wanted to take this to a place of killing him. And that just signifies a whole different level of whether it's misunderstanding, immorality, confusion about the right thing to do. We see that come out at the end. Yeah, Shelley.
It seems to me that everyone here is responsible. The situation was set up, if you will, to fail. Everybody had an axe to grind here, or not an axe to grind, but set up a situation of anger and hatred. And it's interesting that even in the story, if this is so, I don't know the Hebrew, but it says the scrupulousness or the humility, literally the humility displayed, destroyed that temple. That's an interesting comment and an interesting viewpoint that humility would cause the destruction. So I just think there's a lot of contradictions here.
Yeah.
I don't really have an answer. There's
Okay.
too many contradictions.
There's too many, right. It's everybody. Martha.
And I would build on that a little. I think it's the unforgivingness of everyone in the story, that the host will not forgive Ben Kamtza, his enemy, that Ben Kamtza won't forgive the insult, that the rabbis won't forgive the blemish, and that the only one who's actually not to blame is the humility of. So it's sort of that quality of refusing to forgive.
Okay. And I will just note, I think, Martha, you're saying that specific quality that everybody shares, and I'll just note that what I didn't bring, I left out on the text here, but you have it on the sheet that we looked at this morning, that this story is brought, the introduction that brings this story to us is, this is a piece of exegesis on the phrase from Mishle, from Proverbs, happy is the person who fears always, but the one who hardens their heart shall fall into mischief. So the hardening of the heart, we see that in everybody here. Okay, Mark, last one.
So the sages come off like clowns here. And again, we discussed in the first instance, sorry, but I'm not even sure the politics of who the sages were at this time, whether it was all of the rabbis or rabbis that were set in their way. But so the first round is where they don't come to anyone's defense at the banquet itself. Then they come up with a good suggestion, which is let's sacrifice the animal anyway. But then the second suggestion, when it's struck down by Zechariah, is not fight back and say, well, look, we'll make it like Bush v. Gore, not precedent. You know, this doesn't set us up to say we can sacrifice blemished animals, but here we need to do it. Instead, they go in this crazy direction, which reminds me, and I think it was Reuven who says, like, if I can't bring back, you know, my brother, kill my children. And it's like, well, what good does that do? You know, that's why Yehuda steps up and says, I'll be the pledge. So it's a moronic kind of like, it's not a this or that. It's kind of like, okay, here's one idea, and then they're throwing spaghetti on the wall to see if it sticks. And then they come up with like something that's anathema to everything that's possible. Understanding that they were still concerned that the Romans would come marching in as they did, but it made no sense in the context. So they're like flailing. And so I think they're really come off as really in a bad light for the sages.
Great, and I think that there's an interesting difference. This story, as I said, appears in Eikha Rabba, and it's a little bit different, not substantively, but it would be very interesting actually to sit and compare the two, which we're not going to do today. But one of the differences is that at the banquet itself, it is not the chachamim, it is not the sages who are there, who don't do anything, who Bar Kamtza gets upset with. It's Rav Zachariah. It's Rav Zachariah who we see at the end, which means that at some point along the way, somebody decided to take the blame off of one person, at least at this moment in the story, and give it to the entire body of leadership, which is, I think, speaking to what some folks have said about everybody being to blame. No, we can't actually say there was one rabbi, there was one sage who made some bad decisions. Actually, everyone was at the banquet, and everyone was silent. So that's an editorial move that we see from Eikha Rabba to how the text appears here, that I think gives us even a broader sense of everyone being to blame, all of the leadership. The other thing that I want to point out is that at the end, when they're discussing what should be done, the sages thought to sacrifice the animal in order to maintain the peace with the government. Shalom HaMalchut is what the Aramaic says. This story comes toward the end of a chapter in the tractate, where the past chapter and a half we've been seeing examples of when the law is adjusted, or when there is flexibility in the law, mipnei darchei shalom, for the ways of peace, or mipnei tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, the fixing of the world. This is the place where we first see that term. And it's not as much about social justice, but it's about the social order. So we have already seen so many examples here of the rabbi saying, okay, let's take this situation where the law, what the law tells us to do, is actually not going to point us in a good direction, and we're going to make a slight adjustment, or we're going to read a little flexibility into it, mipnei darchei shalom, for the sake of peace. And that seems to be what the rabbis want to do here. But then Rav Zachariah says no, and ultimately that's the way that they go. So I think that again, thinking about why this story was chosen to be put right here in Gittin, it's a very subtle critique, saying, wait a second, Chazal, sages, rabbis, you're flexible, but here you collectively were not. You thought you might be, mipnei darchei shalom, but then ultimately you gave in, and you did not sacrifice this animal as you had originally thought, and that led to the whole downfall. So we're really getting the picture here, both from the words and the context in Gittin of who is to blame, and it's really keeps bleeding out farther and farther. Mark?
Discussed this morning, and it now is echoing back here, and it's in both of these translations. It's interesting because Zechariah says, no, people will think that we can kill a person who blemishes an animal. But there's no indication that anyone saw, as we mentioned that this morning, that Bar Kamtza blemished the animal. It was on the way to Jerusalem, which means that the rabbis or the sages presumed that the emperor sent a clean animal. And they presumed that Bar Kamtza mutilated the animal in such a way as to make it not acceptable sacrifice. Yet there's no indication anywhere in this story that that happens, but that even puts the emperor or Titus or whoever in a better light. I mean, he was really, not only did he give a choice calf, I mean, he picked something beautiful, and the sages believed that the sacrifice coming from the emperor was going to be a worthy sacrifice. So they point their finger at Bar Kamtza, even though we, the reader, don't see where that connection is.
Right. So there's a judgment there. They don't investigate what actually happened. They make a judgment without the proper witnesses, the proper procedures of making judgment. Okay, so let's look at Eikha Rabba and see, where does this story show up? This story shows up in a number of interpretations or commentaries offered on the 2 psukim from the 4th chapter of Eikha. Eikha yu'am zahav, how the gold is dimmed, how the finest gold is dimmed. The sacred stones are scattered at the head of every street. The precious, B'nai Tzion hayikarim, the precious children of Zion, comparable to fine gold. How are they now considered as earthen jugs, the work of a potter? So let me first ask, when you read these verses from Eikha, what is it telling you? What do these verses say to you?
Well, that everything has been degraded, that that we were gold and now we're clay. Now we're nothing but the earth. Sorry.
What's wrong with the work of a potter, though? I mean, a lot of things about chapter 4 I don't understand, but I don't understand why that is devalued. It's as if to say, you know, the precious things are good, but the human things are not.
Okay, beautiful insight there. What's wrong with the work of the hands of the potter? But clearly these verses are setting up the contrast between the gold, the preciousness, the sacred stones, and then what the people have become. So I would say that these psukim are descriptive. They are describing the situation as the author sees it. The people were beautiful. They were precious. The city of Jerusalem was beautiful. It was gold. It was precious gems. And now, putting your comment aside, Harriet, it's nothing. It's earth. So it's a description of the change that has happened to the people and the city of Yerushalayim. What does Eikha Rabba do with this?
It's funny because obviously we read it each year, and these were some of the psukim last night that really stuck out to me in terms of the imagery and just the difference of something that has gone from gold into, like, it once had this glory, and even in the tradition we see this in other places, that people who were once rich and then become poor if they lose their wealth, that the tradition treats them differently, not in the sense of dignity, but just recognizing that there's a difference there, that something that was once glorious and then goes to not, versus just if it was the pottery to begin with. I'm not sure what to make with it, but it's a really it's helpful because it stood out to me last night, and I was just thinking about it now in terms of your comment too, Harriet, and saying what's so wrong with the potter. And we see that imagery also. I'm thinking high holidays. We have this beautiful, like, that we are the clay, like God is the potter. Like, we have beautiful images with that. But when you take it from the gold to then feeling like there's that loss, that's where you start to feel it's the emotion. It's actually not even the language. It's the emotion and the imagery that draws you into the loss.
Yeah. And that's the degradation that you spoke of, Martha, going from one to the other. So a few ideas are brought in Eikha Rabba. After this verse is cited, we see the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, and then the next interpretation is specifically of these words, B'nai Tzion hayikarim, the precious children of Zion. In what way were they precious? Whenever someone would make a meal, he would cover the various dishes with a cloth because of the sensitive ones, so that they would not eat something that would harm them. What does precious mean here to the rabbis? Tempting?
It's, if you don't want to eat something because it might harm you and you have to cover it, what you're covering is tempting you to that you might eat it. I'm thinking of someone who has a gluten allergy or a wheat allergy, and the challah is covered and it's hard. If it was not covered, maybe they just would want to grab it, or people have to wait until the blessing before they eat it and it's covered. I heard that is so it doesn't get jealous of the wine because that is blessed first, but I don't know, that's irrelevant. But that's what I was thinking.
Okay, great. Behind you, Jess.
I was thinking in terms of dietary restrictions, and being sensitive to those who have dietary restrictions. So if you have, you have people who cannot eat a certain food, you cover it. You cover the food that cannot be eaten out of respect for those who can't eat it.
Okay, so two different ways of understanding what is going on here with the covering of the food. Maybe it's actually being very sensitive to people who have food allergies and making sure that they don't eat something that they shouldn't eat. Like now you go to a restaurant or to, kiddush here and things say, contains nuts, contains gluten. There's a sensitivity there, perhaps. You're suggesting it's actually, they're tempting. Both are happening simultaneously. Okay, so there's something in there that's not quite inviting. It's not quite positive. This interpretation does not understand the word yikarim, precious, as anything related to gold or jewels. It's very much like the word precious that we have in English. They were so precious. They were so precious. They had to cover every food item. They were so, maybe it's positive, they were attentive to detail, they were sensitive to people who had allergies, but this is not what Eikha tells us. This seems very far afield from what the verse is describing.
Fragile, and it says that dainty mothers were eating their children. I mean, so that kind of picks up some of the concept of the daintiness, the preciousness of it. I mean, here I was thinking more that they're empathetic. I mean, because while I'll see all these beautiful food items on my table, I'll want to dig in. I have to look out for the possibility that someone else may be offended or sickened by the food, and therefore I'm highly empathetic to the needs of the people around the table, and putting my own needs secondary as opposed to the primary needs of the other people. So I mean, I think there the gloss there is very positive, but I did think the same thing you were saying, precious, the way we use it, dainty, but we see that in other parts of the Eikha text about stepping out into the dirt with your dainty feet and all that, so that comes back there.
Thank you, Mark. So let's look at the next interpretation. Another interpretation, davar acher, the precious children of Zion. Whenever someone was invited to a meal, he would turn his left sleeve inside out, so that if someone else approached him to invite him, he, the second inviter, would know that the first person was already invited to another meal and would not make a false claim. Okay, a couple things going on here. First of all, what's this bit at the end about making a false claim? We learn elsewhere that one of the rabbinic understandings of a certain aspect of Lashon Hara is to invite someone when you know they're not going to be able to come over. Right? Because there's something, you're putting out words that you don't really mean. It makes you look good because you're hospitable, you're generous, you know, bringing someone in, but you know that they're not going to be able to come, so not really. It's putting on a pretense. So they're trying to avoid that. This midrash is saying the people were trying to avoid that situation of someone making a false claim. But how is that avoided? There's a physical change, a physical sign. You turn up your left sleeve. And so if you're, you know, at Kiddush and you see someone with their left sleeve turned up, you'll know they're already invited to someone else's house for lunch and you shouldn't invite them. And this was the signal. Good. So this action makes it possible both to not make the false claim, to not invite someone knowing they're already invited, or it opens up the possibility of someone saying, "Oh, I'm going to invite them because I know for sure that they're invited elsewhere." So maybe it opens up more opportunity for dishonesty.
I don't understand the first one, because if I don't know that you're invited somewhere else, I can't be making a false claim, right?
No, it's in the case where you do know that the person cannot come, either because they're invited somewhere else or they're otherwise occupied. So yes, it's not a false claim if you invite someone and you didn't know that they weren't available. Shelley, you have your sleeves. Well, you have both your sleeves rolled up, so I don't know what the midrash would say about that. So on the one hand, we might read this positively. There's a signal, there's a social norm that's put in place to avoid a situation of someone being embarrassed, perhaps making this false claim. It also could potentially be embarrassing for someone who's invited and they are already busy, and to say, you know, maybe it's awkward to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I already have plans," or "I can't do it," or "My baby has to nap," or whatever. whatever the reason is. So we're trying to prevent that. The rabbis are the rabbis are understanding that there was a construct in place that everyone understood that would prevent that. Or it's as Mark says, it actually opens up the possibility for people to go through with these false claims. But again, the word yikarim, the word precious, has nothing to do with gold, has nothing to do with gems, has nothing to do with anything that we see in the pasuk from Eikha. It's once again, we can understand it as the daintiness or the preciousness or the attention to detail. Oh, they have this little system, this little subtle thing that they do. They're so precious everywhere, and you have to do it right. If you don't turn up your sleeve, they're socially refined. There's systems in place to make sure that things go smoothly socially, relations between people.
I feel like there's actually, I'm really struck by this, and I think that it's not only socially refined, like I think it also says something about it's like midot. It's like, what types of people are they that they, like, it's beautiful that this is what we'd say is precious. And like, I just love that that's where the rabbis take it. And like when I'm thinking about if someone were to say, you know, I hope that someone would come over and I were hosting them, that they would say, "Oh, she's the type of person that I'm gluten-free and she didn't put out any gluten and made the whole meal to cater to me," because it's saying like, even more than social, it's like we value each and every person. There's like a value to the feeling of what it is to have one individual as a part of a larger. So maybe that's social, but there's also that is precious. That's something that feels beyond beauty.
The midot, the qualities, the characteristics of hospitality, of focusing on the needs of another person. Maybe that's what is precious. Yeah. Yeah.
Back when this was written, did they even know that certain foods were healthy and unhealthy? Did they have any clue that you shouldn't eat maybe fatty foods or foods with too much sugar, or people have allergies? I don't have no idea what was written back then to even make that idea make sense, what I came up with and what you were talking about.
That's a great question, and there's definitely an understanding that certain foods are unhealthy, that people have such things as allergies. There are places in the Talmud that talk about, the punishment for eating this thing or eating that thing, or this, if you eat this thing, it's going to cause this physical ailment, kind of, again. And so it could absolutely, yeah, that seems to be knowledge that the rabbis of this time have. Now we have a third explanation. Another interpretation, the precious children of Zion. No one would attend a meal unless he knew who else would be there, and who would be mixing the wine and who would be serving. Similarly, no one would sign a document unless he knew the other signatories, because of, this verse from Exodus, from Shemot, do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. So what is happening here? Again, precious seems not the way that it's portrayed in Eikha, but there's something, let's look at the first half for a moment. There's something very particular about the way people can or cannot accept invitations and show up in each other's homes. Now, yeah.
It seems a bit more of a skepticism about other people and whether their standards meet their own. So people care about, whether this person is righteous enough to perform a deed. So it's a bit more sinister.
So maybe it's a little sinister or cynical. There's some aspect, we might read this as, you're only going to go if you know that the good people are there. If you're invited to the party of the A-list, maybe that's what's going on here, or that you want to, you're judging the quality of the other person's meal, whether it's their level of kashrut or who's mixing the wine, which again could be a matter of kashrut if someone not Jewish was mixing the wine. So I think it's a two-sided coin. There's something negative about that. Maybe there's also something positive about it. They would do this because they didn't want to have meals and socialize with people who weren't good people. Or maybe, like the case with Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, if Bar Kamtza had thought about it for a moment and he had known who was going to be at the meal, namely his enemy, maybe he wouldn't have gone if he had thought about it for 5 minutes. And so maybe this is saying, let's protect social relationships, because sometimes people don't get along. And so you should know who's going to be invited to the meal that you're going to be invited to, so that you know that it's someone you get along with and it's not going to be disruptive.
We had a discussion last week about Devarim, and it occurs to me, remember we talked about the different cities, and one of them was actually, as Jonathan Sachs says, a made-up city, no gold. They didn't want gold there because that brought back the golden calf, and it just, somehow I'm looking at this and I'm saying, it was perhaps like, this was prescient, that gold corrupts, precious things can corrupt, and that's what this seems to be about. And I'm just thinking about just this past in Devarim, just that, where it says they went to, and you pointed out to me all the cities were cities where we sinned, the cities they went to. But I was struck by that one city of no gold, which Jonathan Sachs says doesn't really exist, but it was there for a purpose. No gold. Because gold corrupted the golden calf and things of that type. It just seemed to strike me.
Good. I think you're picking up on this subtle progression or this subtle complication of the word precious. In Eikha, it means something very clearly precious, gold, gems, etc. Then we have these descriptions of what it means in the context of the social mores of the time, which seem nice. We're sensitive to other people's allergies. We want to make sure someone doesn't invite someone when they're already invited somewhere else. But there's a little bit of a dark side to each of these. And I think you're seeing that, Shelley, and like there's some not explicit, but there's an implicit understanding of the possibility of preciousness corrupting, gold corrupting. So maybe there's something going on here where we're seeing another side. Felicia, you had a hand.
I think also, I mean, in all three examples, social norms are meant to create a baseline, but they also could presume to control everything. And that life actually doesn't always, like if you presume that that's going to regulate everything in the midst of something that falls out, I mean, speaking of the Bar Kamtza story is like things just like don't go as expected, and it's just like a like domino effect of like what doesn't fit within certain norms or expectations. And there's something I think about these three examples that it's like to try to like create a controlled scenario so that no mistakes are made. And in a scenario like that, there's an inevitability that something is going to go awry. And so in the daintiness or the social controls, while there is a certain amount of sensitivity, there's a certain assumption that things can be regulated to the point that no mistakes can be made, but that is not the way life works.
This seems like a theme with Jewish law is like to make a gate, put a fence around it to make sure people don't accidentally cross it. So, okay, let's avoid Lashon Hara by not having anybody there that we might want to talk badly about, or not being around someone that we might want to talk badly about, and we don't want to tempt somebody who we're trying to get to be careful about a certain diet, so we'll cover it up so we can't be part of their health demise or something. I mean, people, I'm sure everybody knows people who are struggling with sugar or some other issue, and you have to, it's like a daily thing that's an issue.
So it sounds like you're reading it in a positive light. This is a fence around people's behaviors to avoid.
I'm not reading it in a positive or a negative, because the fences lead to more fences that lead to more fences that lead to more fences, and then it gets to the point of absurdity where people don't get it and just want to throw out everything.
Okay.
So I'm not putting a positive or a negative spin around it. I'm just saying, this is so common in the way that everything else is handled. It's not surprising.
Okay. Right. This is what's going on here. Mm-hmm. Did you want to say something, Sonia?
Well, to add to what Shelley and Felicia were saying, and I think we're all building up to, it's not possible to regulate life the way life actually is. And it's not only not possible, but there's some danger in being too precious, let's say, about, trying to do that. There's danger. We all have that sense now. There's the lurking kind of underlying, possibility of something falling apart or exploding, which we're seeing right now.
Can I add something? It seems to like contribute eventually to two different things. To kind of keep people isolated and not mixing with people who are different than them and trying to understand them, and then it could lead to a greater divide. And also this narrowness that people are allowed to do less and less. Like, let's not have mixed seating, it might lead to mixed dancing. You know, it's just another fence. So to me, it has two issues that are problematic that it leads to.
Yeah, so this aspect of the social control, we want to avoid disputes, we want to avoid people, you know, sitting with the people they don't like so much. You know, you think about that when you're, you know, when I was planning my wedding, right? You're like, who's going to sit at this table? Is it going to be these people with these people? Like, there's a lot of attention that you want to pay to that this family member with that family member. But there's a regulation, as Felicia said, a control that is really limiting on people, that doesn't give people the space in those intimate social spaces of a meal in someone's home to sit with someone who they don't get along with, perhaps, and they don't share the same opinions with, and for them to have a conversation. Let's look at the next one. He closes doors. Okay. So speaking of closed doors, I'm going to move on to the next one. Another interpretation. The precious children of Zion. In what way were they precious? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel taught that there was a great custom in Jerusalem, that at the start of a meal, the host would hang a cloth on the front door. As long as the cloth was hanging there, the guests could enter. But once the cloth was taken away, no one had permission to enter. What do you make of this? Jewish time. We're trying to avoid people being late. We want people to know, right? This is when they say at the theater, like, the doors will shut at this time, and then you'll be seated according to the discretion of an usher, right? You can't just saunter in at at your time and think that you can just sit down and kind of catch up. Aviv.
You could say also that there was no selection of people. People could come as they come, and there's a moment that when the clothes went down, there was didn't matter who you are, were you invited, not invited, you important person or not. So this way it's all welcome, regardless who you are, but there's a moment we cannot let you in anymore.
So there's an ambiguity there, right? Because the translation says guests. So it seems to me that these are people who are invited. So it's not, I mean, that's even more beautiful, but it's also, it seems to me more difficult, because if you don't know how many people are coming, and here I read it to mean that you've invited 25 people, and there's a time limit to when they can come in. Not that anyone who sees a white cloth as they're walking down the street can say, oh, I'm starving, let me go into that house and have a meal.
Right. So Aviv, I think you're offering a very generous read of this, because you're right, it doesn't say this meant only the people who were invited could come in, and then they couldn't after this cloth was put on the door. But taken in context with all of the other rules that were being given here, we're getting a picture of a society that is pretty rigid about how people interact with one another. You have to be invited, you can't be invited, you can only come in at this time. So I would say that while I think looking at this interpretation in isolation, Aviv, offers that the possibility of your reading, I think when you look at it in the larger whole of this piece of Eikha Rabba, it's actually has the potential to I don't know that it means that it's suggesting that there was a generosity and a hospitality. I think it is more about the people who were invited, and at a certain time they can't come into the building anymore. Now this is maybe a good thing. It's nice to start your meal with everyone at the table and not have a disruption when someone walks in late. On the other hand, Jess, you want to?
I was just thinking about a children's birthday party with the balloon outside the building, and all of the politics and diet and everything else that comes with hosting a party for young children, because there's the dynamic of the kids, who gets along, who doesn't, the dynamic of the parents, who gets along, who doesn't, all the social differences between the groups all coming together. And all with this marker with a sign. It's usually balloons or some sort of sign for a child's birthday party, and precious children of Zion, and this sort of childlike complexity that comes with it.
Great, thank you. Shelley.
There's just something here that strikes me. If you know about Rabbi Gamliel, he was a very wealthy individual. And I just can't help, I've seen this story before, and I always get the feeling that this was, because there were stories about him dealing with other people who he felt were beneath him. I just can't get over the idea that he's got this big fancy dinner coming with the cloth hanging outside, and get all the people in, take that cloth in. I don't want the rabble coming in. I just got that feeling, knowing, if you know the cast of characters, you know who he was. I could see that within his character. So I think there's a little more to the story. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's
Sheba, it's his son, Sheba Ben Gamliel, but he could have inherited this character.
He did.
It just makes me think that the purpose of all these interpretations are to put the word precious in Eikha in air quotes. You might think precious is wonderful, but there's a whole other side to it.
This is a very different read of the word precious. And I think we only have another couple of minutes, so we won't look at we'll just skip to the last one, actually. The final interpretation that's given of the precious children of Zion. In what way were they precious? No one would enter until being called in for the meal. So again, there's a regulation. There's a rule about how people can come together. I want to suggest that in these interpretations, not only do we see a highly regulated society, but the possibility for shame exists in each one of these things. Because if you are new to the community, or you're visiting from another community, and you don't know these rules, you are on the outside from the very beginning. If you are if you come from a place where people came in to the meal as soon as they got to the house, then it would be very embarrassing to walk in and then be told, you have to get out. You can't come in until you're called. It would be very embarrassing for someone who didn't know the code of the cloth hanging on the door if they walked in after that cloth was taken away. So the possibility for exclusivity, both the rigidity and the lack of understanding of the fact that life cannot be totally regulated, people make mistakes, but also this is a very exclusionary or exclusive way of living. And I think that may be, in my read of this, I think what we're seeing here is a rabbinic critique of the overall culture. It's seen through the lens, or it's portrayed through the lens of eating, the most intimate interaction in someone's home, but it can also be understood, I think, as a statement about the culture overall. This was a culture that had so many rules that some people were in and some people were out, which is ultimately what happens in the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. One person's in and one person's out. So it's a commentary on the larger society, that when there are too many rules, when there isn't the flexibility, the possibility for incredible shame, embarrassment, outsiderness arises. And again, going back to its place, the placement of the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, where it is in Masechet Gittin, coming after a series of examples where the rabbis were a little flexible. And so there we see it's another place, it's another way of seeing the contrast, that when you're not flexible, when you are so rigid, this is what happens. People can be destroyed. Cities can be destroyed. The final conclusion of this story in Masechet Gittin, the narrative actually goes on much longer than we tend to read it, because the actual story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza ends, but the Gemara continues with a couple of pages of a whole series of other events, domino effect, that came after Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. And then the final conclusion of the incident of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza and its aftermath is the following. Tanya, it was taught in a Braita, so this is bringing in another very early Tanaitic text. Amar Rabbi Elazar said, "Come and see how great is the power of shame. Kama gedola kocha shel busha." How great is the power of shame. Now we could just stop there and say, how great is the power of shame. That's what led to the destruction of the temple. But he goes further and he says, Sheharei siya hakadosh baruch hu et bar kamtza, for the Holy One, blessed be, assisted Bar Kamtza, and he destroyed his temple and he burned his sanctuary. God saw how shamed, how humiliated Bar Kamtza was because of this culture. Because of the culture. It wasn't just this one incident. No, it was everyone is responsible. The whole society was operating in this way. And God says, this can't be. And this is an astounding statement, that God destroyed God's temple and burned God's sanctuary. That God was so appalled, upset, that in some ways God is responsible. God then allowed all these other things to happen that would lead to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. So that is a very loud critique of the society that allowed for this incident to occur. And I think we could spend a lot more time talking about what are the implications of this story for us, but I think very clearly right away it tells us that the things we choose to do and the rules we make in our own homes ripple out. The society, the culture of the world that we live in, or the society that we live in, it manifests in our home, and it ripples out to just the way people operate, the way people are. So what does that say to us in looking at our own behavior? Not just us individually, but the culture that we live in, does it support harmony? Does it support peaceful relations? Does it support generosity? Or does it support, ultimately, shame and exclusiveness? And that led God to be so upset that God said, okay, I'm going to let these events happen that will lead to the destruction of the temple. So I think very powerful lessons for us in our times. And I hope this was also an interesting way of reading a story and seeing how a different context can give you new insights into what is going on in that story. So thank you, everyone.